So what we're seeing right now is countries around the world stepping up testing and rolling out fresh restrictions to limit the spread of the new Omicron COVID variant. Many of you have been sending us your questions about the variant and the travel restrictions that many countries have now implemented. And we're going to try and answer those questions for you. With us is Professor David Montefiore, immunologist at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and Julia Lo Bue-Said, CEO of the Advantage Travel Partnership Group. She's in Hertfordshire in England. It's lovely to see you both, and thank you for taking the time to answer some of our questions. As I was sifting through them, you could really get a sense of the concern many people have about the variant, and in some cases there's a bit of a sense of panic too. David, could I start by asking you, at this point today, what is your biggest worry?
Well, there are two things that I'm looking at very carefully. One is, will this variant be more contagious than Delta and be able to outcompete it? And the other one is the genetics of this virus have a strong indication that it's likely to evade our vaccines to a greater extent than any previous variants.
And Julia, for you, as we see travel restrictions being imposed around the world, borders going up again, what's your biggest concern?
Yeah, biggest concern, Lucy, outside of any public health measures that are required, is really the knock-on impact that's going to create for the industry and travellers that want to travel and are desperate to travel and continue travelling around the world.
Julia, on that, our first question comes from Rebecca, who says there's a growing list of countries that have imposed restrictions on South Africa and Southern African countries. Do you think that there will be more to follow?
It's so difficult, isn't it? Very unhelpful almost to speculate on this. I guess back to the point and the question you asked before, we need to watch very closely what authorities do, keep a really close eye on it, and be very clear in terms of what they do with their border policies, which clearly does have a huge impact on travel. We do hope that the list doesn't continue. Clearly, it's devastating for the Southern African community, but also for industries right across the world that are so reliant on that corridor.
David, we've been looking closely over the past few days at what's happening in South Africa. A lot of young people there with the new variant, and we're hearing these anecdotal reports that a lot of them are not getting very sick, that actually their illness is slightly different to, say, Delta. And this question from Jeff expressed some concern or questions about that. He says, why is there no information or discussion about how ill those with the Omicron variant have become?
Yeah, well, we have to remember that this variant was only first discovered 3 weeks ago and really only came to the attention of physicians and scientists last week. So it's still too early to understand what the pathogenesis of this new variant is going to be. Yes, it would appear that most of the infections that have occurred so far are in younger people where the disease tends to be mild. That doesn't mean that younger people are more susceptible to this variant. It just means that they were the first people to be infected, and South Africa has a younger population overall. It's just too early to know yet, so time will tell.
So I asked this question of some immunologists in South Africa yesterday, David, and it's come through quite strongly from other people who have emailed this. If the variant is less fatal because of its mutations but more contagious than Delta, this is a question from David. If it replaces Delta, does that actually mean this is good news because it's more mild?
Well, yes, it depends on what the fatality rate actually is. If it's very low, it's conceivable that this virus will eventually evolve into another common cold virus, like several of the close cousins of SARS-CoV-2. Nobody's expecting that to happen this soon, but this virus has surprised us in the past. So that could be potentially good news if, in fact, the fatality rate was low enough.
And just to be clear, we don't yet know whether or not it is more transmissible, do we?
We don't. We really don't.
OK, Julia, one for you from Naomi, who is in Stockholm. Everyone looking ahead to Christmas. It's such a busy time with so many people travelling all over the world, hoping to see family for Christmas. She's wondering how this is going to affect her if she wants to travel back to the UK during Christmas, or for anyone who's travelling to the UK from a non-red list country.
Okay, so as of today, the rules for entry did change. I mean, the single biggest change is the type of test you need to take, which is the PCR test, more expensive test. You have to self-isolate on arrival once you've taken that test in your final destination until you get your test results back. So as it stands today, unfortunately, again, it's a little too early to know beyond 3 weeks' time. That's when these rules were in place until what Naomi or anyone else can do. But as it stands right now, anyone looking to travel in the next couple of weeks, continue to travel as planned, but they will need to take the PCR test, self-isolate until their results come through. Beyond then, we'll have to wait and see what the government changes will be past the next few weeks.
I mean, Julia, we were hearing from our correspondent at Gatwick today who said people are getting off flights who had no idea about this PCR test because it's so new. Is your other piece of advice to people just to constantly check for updates on what the regulations and rules are?
Yeah, it's a very evolving situation, and unless you book through a travel agent or tour operator who's going to be able to update you all the time, everyone needs to keep really, really close to the detail. It's also worth just double checking the destination you're traveling to and the destination you're leaving, because those rules have to now be looked at quite differently, just making sure that they kind of can go together. So really important to keep checking local government advice.
David, there's so much reliance now on the lateral flow tests. I know in my household we do them every week. My kids do them as well. They're sent home with them from school. We certainly have them here at the BBC. Here's a question from Gareth saying, can lateral flow tests detect the new variant?
The new variant can only be detected with tests that look at the genes of the virus, so like the PCR test. The lateral flow test looks at the proteins of the virus. And right now, those tests are not able to differentiate between the Omicron variant and other variants.
How long could it be before that technology comes into place, do you think, where they will be able to?
It could take quite a while. It would require identifying antibody reagents that are specific for the Omicron variant and don't cross-react with any of the other variants, and that's going to be a technical challenge.
Julia, here's a tricky one around travel as well, and it involves the issue of transiting. Joseph says, I'm travelling through the UK to Ireland from South Africa, transiting at Heathrow Airport on the way to Dublin. He wants to know if he's required to quarantine in the UK before travelling on to Ireland.
Really good question. So Ireland do not have a managed quarantine facility as we do here in England. So as Joseph is an Irish citizen, he can travel, he can transit via Heathrow. He must stay airside. He can't leave the airport to fly on to Dublin. The reason for that also is Dublin doesn't have direct flights into South Africa. Once he arrives in Dublin, he will need to self-isolate at home for 14 days. There are a number of tests that he will also have to do, as well as the Irish government require anyone travelling back into Ireland from a red list destination to take a test 72 hours before arriving back. So quite a few things to navigate through, but he will not, principally Joseph will not need to quarantine in London when he as a transit passenger.
David, we had lots of questions about the current vaccines because, of course, all governments now are really stepping up their message around everyone getting vaccinated and also in some countries getting their booster shot if they're eligible. This question from Philippa says, I had my booster at the end of October. My worry is how strong is the vaccine now against the new variant and how long before we know if it will be effective?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. I do strongly recommend that people get vaccinated, and if they're eligible, that they get boosted. We're still dealing primarily with the Delta variant. We don't know whether or not Omicron is going to take off in the rest of the world. But if it does, chances are that the vaccines will still be effective against it. The vaccines have been effective against all of the variants so far, for the most part. This one looks like it could be a larger problem for vaccines than any of the previous variants, and that is based on the mutations that are found in the spike protein of this variant. But there's still a very good chance that the vaccines are going to be cross-protective to some extent, probably with some reduced efficacy, but hopefully with still fairly good efficacy, especially against severe illness and death. But we just have to wait and see. It's going to take
David,
about
that
2 to
wait
3
and
more
see
weeks.
moment is quite frustrating for people when they hear that. We have to wait and see. To the second part of Philippa's question, she really wants to know how long it's going to take before we know. I mean, as a scientist and around the world, how much data do you need? Are we talking 1 week, 2 weeks, a month?
Yeah, we're talking 2 to 4 weeks. There are two different levels of investigation that get at that answer. The first level is testing serum samples from people who got vaccinated in the laboratory to see how well their antibodies in those serum samples can neutralize the virus. And scientists like myself are rushing right now to get the virus in our laboratory grown up so that we can run those tests. It's going to take 2 to 3 weeks to get any answers, and multiple people are rushing to get answers to those questions. Again, it's going to take 2 to 3 weeks to get answers from those tests, which are a fairly reliable indicator of how well the vaccines are likely to work. And then eventually clinical data. You really have to have clinical data to confirm how effective the current vaccines are, and that's going to take probably several months.
Julia, a question from Dale for you. What do mandatory PCR tests mean for travellers and for those who have previously had COVID as well and have been told not to test for 90 days?
Oh, I think out of every comment we get from travellers from our industry, this is one of the most frustrating. So the UK government does not recognise recovery from COVID and therefore doesn't provide any certification. Our NHS, our health service website, provides detail that informs travellers here in the UK that if you've tested positive for COVID within 90 days, you should not take a PCR test. Unfortunately, when it comes to international travel, UK government does not exempt anybody that has previously had COVID. So it creates so much confusion, so much uncertainty. So essentially, you will still have to undertake a PCR test. I have to say, Lucy, we have put this out and we are querying this with the government right now because it's at complete odds with the information that we're getting from our health service. So we'll get further clarity on that. But as it stands at the minute, you will still need to take a PCR test if you're in recovery.
Thanks for that, Julia. David, back to you. There is another question here around the vaccines, of course, and you've been saying that we think the vaccines are going to work. We just don't know to what extent they will. And this one from Paul is a question around timing again, that if it does need to be modified, the vaccine, is that complicated and how long will it take?
Well, we saw very early on how the companies adjusted to the alpha and beta variants. They quickly made, and in the mRNA technology especially, this can be done very quickly. And some of the companies like Pfizer and Moderna quickly made alpha and beta versions and now delta versions of their vaccines. And I'm already hearing that they're working on making Omicron versions of their vaccine. So that can happen very quickly. And now that we have reliable immune biomarkers, those clinical trials we can get an answer from them a lot quicker these days and get regulatory approval even sooner than we saw with the initial vaccines.
David, can I ask a very quick question from me, actually? The lab and the petri dish is one thing, but I wonder if the human body's immune system is still throwing up some surprises for you.
We still don't understand the body's immune response to this virus completely. We know some of the immune responses that correlate with how well the vaccines work, and we use those measurements as a guidepost, and neutralizing antibodies is one of those. But there are certainly other types of immune responses in the body that can protect against this virus, and scientists are struggling to understand those responses and to be able to apply that information to guide the development of newer vaccines in the future.
It's been so valuable to have your insights, both of you. Thank you very much. Many thanks to Professor David Montefiore, immunologist at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and Julia Lo Bue-Said, CEO of the Advantage Travel Partnership Group, who joined us from here in England. You've been watching Your Question.